Okay, remote work during and after COVID-19. Lisa and Steve, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Dina. And if we could go to the next slide, please. We're going to start actually pre-pandemic. Basically, remote work isn't a new thing, but it's historically has not been as prevalent as it is today. Obviously, in March 2020, employers were forced to revision what the workplace looks like as shutdown orders forced most non-essential workers to work from home. And now post-pandemic, as you can see on the right here, some statistics, remote work is much more prevalent than it has been in the past. If you could go to the next slide, Mary. So 2021 has seen some welcome developments for employers with regard to the easing and lifting of state and local capacity restrictions, which have allowed a return to the workplace. Despite this, a variety of major companies are planning to continue remote work. For example, Amazon, Google, and Lyft have all announced that most office workers will not be returning until 2022. And many employers are providing employees with flexibility to work remotely at least some of the time. In addition to the safety benefits that come from this, it's also pretty popular with employees. Surveys are demonstrating that most employees prefer the ability to work remotely at least some of the time. And these statistics to me are just staggering. Glassdoor has indicated that candidates seeking remote work grew 460% from June 2019 to June 2021. And according to flexjobs.com, 58% of workers said they would look for new jobs if they cannot continue working from home in their current role. So there's likely to be a transition period through the coming year as businesses continue to experiment with an appropriate mix of work from the office and remote work, but it's likely to be here to stay in some form for most employers. Okay, next slide, please, Mary. So there are some benefits to remote work. Obviously, employee morale and work-life balance. There are potential cost savings to employers, and reduced overhead is always a good thing. There's the ability to recruit employees from other marketplaces, candidates who may otherwise have not seemed, like good or even potential candidates or fits. It also incentivizes potential job candidates who view the flexibility of remote work as a benefit in their job searches. And then finally, there are some societal benefits such as reduced traffic, greenhouse emissions, and so forth. If we could go to the next slide, please, Mary. Now, there are some drawbacks too. First of all, not everybody can do it. Depending on the job or the industry, it may not be feasible. For example, people in healthcare, hospitality, construction, for example, often have more difficulty working remotely. Second of all, it can be detrimental to fostering camaraderie and workplace culture. And this is a big concern for many employers. It's just more difficult to get to know and trust your colleagues if you're not sharing the same office space with them. Additionally, newer hires can be overlooked or passed over for new opportunities or for work simply as a function of low visibility when people aren't sharing the same office space. Another drawback, less employee supervision. It's obviously more difficult to tell what an employee is doing with their time when they're not in the office, and some employees take advantage. Not all. I think that generally employers have found that employees can be just as effective remotely. Nevertheless, supervision can be a concern. There's less control over how confidential and trade secret information is handled, which is problematic for reasons we'll discuss a little later on. And there's lots of traps for the unwary when it comes to complying with applicable laws. Depending on the length of the relationship where the remote workers are stationed, you could have the laws of numerous jurisdictions, some of which you're just frankly not familiar with, applying to your remote workforce. So that's something we'll discuss in just a minute here too. Mary, next slide, please. So we're going to talk about a scenario, and this involves our friend Charlie at ABC Corp. Charlie's a non-exempt administrative assistant, and under ABC's flex work policy, employees are encouraged to come into work, but they're not obligated to do so. Despite the encouragement to come into work, Charlie has been fully remote for 3 straight months, and his work performance during this time has been nothing short of stellar. He's available first thing in the morning and all through the day. And he even attends to emails late at night and on the weekends when he otherwise would not be expected to do so. So, Lisa, it sounds like Charlie's killing it performance-wise. It's probably not great that he's not coming in when there's the encouragement to come into work. But what are your thoughts? Does this scenario raise any red flags?
Great question, Steve. And I think that, we probably have a lot of clients who encounter this kind of scenario where, when somebody is working remotely and the work product's getting done, I think that that's the most important thing, certainly from a substantive standpoint, but what other questions do we need to ask? So let's think about that. Next slide. Well, when we talk about Charlie working from home, we need to remember that Charlie is not exempt. And so he is entitled to overtime pay under federal and probably state wage and hour laws. So even though it seems great that Charlie is working really hard and he's getting his work done and he's getting it done and, really quickly, how many hours is Charlie working in a week? And is he going over 40? And even if he's doing it from the comfort of his home office and he's really happy to be there and really comfortable, once Charlie works more than 40 hours, or if he's in some states like California, which have different overtime laws where overtime might even be required if he works more than 8 hours in a day, we need to make sure that Charlie is being paid appropriately. I want to say one thing very clearly. Just because an employee is paid a salary does not make them exempt. You need to be paid a salary and perform exempt job duties. That's a really common question that we get all the time. And a lot of people, unfortunately, incorrectly assume that paying salary is enough. That is not the case. And it doesn't matter how good someone is at their job. It doesn't matter how much you value them. If they are not doing exempt job duties that meet certain specifications under the law, they have to be paid overtime. So we need to think about tracking Charlie's time. Is Charlie, submitting a weekly timesheet? Is he somehow verifying the hours that are worked? We cannot just assume that somebody is working 9 to 5 if they're non-exempt. We need to know actually how many hours they're working, including any breaks. Next slide. So when we think about other potential legal issues of remote work, we want to make sure that we're not stepping into any potential discrimination claims. We want to apply our remote work policies and opportunities uniformly as possible to all employees in similar roles. So if Charlie's allowed to work from home, but Susie is not, and they do the same job and have the same title and largely the same job duties, why is that, right? We don't want there to ever be the perception or the inadvertent, policy application where people in one group are allowed to do something and people in another group or in a protected category don't have the same benefits or leniency. So we want to be consistent. And of course, we also want to always make sure, and this is particular with respect to new hires, that we're continuing to follow all immigration and I-9 policies that we need to. Just because someone is working remotely does not mean that those laws don't apply and you don't have to worry about collecting that paperwork. It's still just as important as if they were coming to the office. Next slide. A really big area of potential risk, if not handled appropriately, is compliance with state and local laws with remote workers. And again, we need to think about if somebody is working remotely and that's their position, and it's not just a temporary situation where they happen to be remote right now because your building's under construction or you closed down for 1 week due to a COVID cleaning and now you're reopening. If they're really a remote position, the laws that you need to consider are the laws of the state and the city where they are working. So it might be really great and convenient for your company that now you can hire employees all over the country because you realize that they actually can do the work remotely and you don't actually have to look in, let's say, Philadelphia. You can look in California, you can look in Texas, wherever. That's great. But what laws apply to those employees? How are they paying their taxes in terms of their pay stub? Are you following the appropriate new hire processes? So as much as it's a benefit to have remote workers, as we've said, we know that logistically it's really nice and maybe it's great, to a great impact on the footprint of your office. Maybe you don't have to rent as many office spaces. That's all well and good, but you're going to step into hot water real quickly if you are assuming that, your one size policy and handbook for your corporate office is a one size fits all for all staff, because that's not the case. Next slide. And where we see this come up in particular, and what we hope everyone is aware of and continues to be aware of, is specifically with respect, other than overtime, I would say the biggest question we get is about leave laws and paid sick time and things like that. So from a starting standpoint, everyone should be aware that more and more state and local jurisdictions are requiring paid sick leave for employees who work in those areas. I can tell you as an example, by the way, if you do any business in California, kudos to you, just, in general, but you should know that state sick or the sick laws are not just statewide. There's local sick laws depending on where in the state you work. Most other jurisdictions, it's specific to, either a statewide law or only specific cities. So in Pennsylvania, there's a Philadelphia paid sick time ordinance that is not statewide, but if you work in Philadelphia, it applies to you. In New York, there's now statewide paid sick leave. So again, it depends, but it's all about where is the employee working, not where your corporate headquarters is located. And so you want to make sure to check your policies, make sure you're in compliance. And if you do transition a role or hire someone newly in that position, a lot of rules, by the way, require that on day one of employment, that employee starts accruing paid sick time, right? So maybe they're not able to use sick time right away, but they need to have a bank showing that they're accruing, or you're giving them a sick time in a certain amount from day one. In most places, that's 40 hours for the year, but it does vary by location. And then just be aware of making sure you have your workers' liability and workers' comp insurance in place for all areas where you're doing business, and that you're providing proper notices that are specific to state laws to all employees based on where they're working. Next slide. Okay, we want to throw another scenario at you that we think, is really relevant to this day and age. Jean is a senior associate at XYZ LLC, a venture capital firm. Given the flexibility that comes with remote work, she sometimes sets up her laptop to work from a local coffee shop. On Friday, she had a Zoom call with the CEO of her employer, and Jean participated from the coffee shop. The purpose of the call was to discuss Jean's due diligence regarding a potential investment. Jean wore headphones so that no one could hear what Anne was saying, and no one appeared to be around Jean during the discussion. During the call, Anne asked about various details regarding the target's finances, and Jean could readily answer them with the help of the spreadsheet she had printed out in advance. Anne left the meeting with everything she wanted and expected of Jean. Sounds great. Jean was prepared. She had her printed spreadsheets. She was ready to go with the answers. Steve, should Anne be concerned about the way Jean conducted herself during that Zoom meeting?
Yeah, not with regard to the content, but certainly with regard to the judgment in the manner in which it was communicated. Here we've got a scenario where whether or not they could hear Anne, they could certainly hear Jean talking in the coffee shop if they were close enough. Second of all, she had a laptop up. When Anne was not on the screen, it was likely that, confidential information in preparation for the call was, and it's possible that, people walking by could have seen that. Third of all, she printed all this confidential information and had it on the table while she was talking to Anne. So, that was presumably there before and after as well. Who knows who could have walked by and seen it? Who knows if Jean left it unattended? I think that Anne would be justifiably concerned about the way that Jean handles confidential information in general on the basis of just that one exchange. So as this scenario demonstrates, and I think we can probably go to the next slide now, please. There are really a lot of issues that remote work can pose with regard to potentially sensitive information getting disclosed, whether it's voluntary or involuntary. As employees access confidential information remotely or remove confidential information from the office, employers lose a certain amount of control over what is done with that information. This could pose a competitive risk if the information relates to customers' competitive pricing, something else that if it was in the hands of a competitor could be beneficial and lead to a loss of business for the employer. There's also potential ramifications in terms of statutory compliance. There's myriad statutes that apply to certain categories of information. You've got HIPAA with regard to health related information, FERPA with regard to student records, Graham-Leach-Bliley with regard to financial data of financial customers, and then also just consumer privacy acts that are being passed really around the country that may protect this information. So there could be statutory violations in connection with remote employees if they're not careful with what's being done with confidential information. Also, confidentiality obligations to third parties should be kept in mind. Here, it's very, very likely, almost certain, that there was a non-disclosure agreement in place between Gene and Ann's company and the target that they were discussing. So could that have been breached by means of that conversation? Possibly. So we need to keep in mind that employers often have confidentiality obligations to third parties that need to be attended to. Okay, if we could go to the next slide, please. So avoiding some of the legal and practical problems of remote work, we've already discussed ensuring that the company is on top of all potentially applicable laws at every level. And also it's important to ensure that employees are bound by appropriate confidentiality agreements and other restrictive covenants that are necessary to protect employers' legitimate business interest in their confidential information and goodwill. With regard to, kind of some of the behavioral issues that can pop up in remote work, it's very important to clearly and repeatedly communicate expectations to employees, both verbally and in writing through means of a formal written remote work policy. And then that policy should be applied uniformly to all similarly situated employees to avoid scenarios in which it could lead to claims of discrimination. And if we could go to the next slide, we'll talk about some components of effective remote work policies. Really, the first thing that a remote work policy should do is define who is eligible for remote work. Remote work policies may be, or remote work may be appropriate for certain positions and not for others. So employers should document in their policies, what kind of position is appropriate for remote work and how often remote work will be available. Is it part-time, 2 days a week? Is it full-time, et cetera? Since each position has different job-specific requirements, team-based activities, there are key differences to keep in mind when deciding what kinds of positions might be eligible. And employers may wish to set eligibility requirements that include, for example, years of service. Is this a benefit that's being offered to more senior employees? Is this something that's going to be available to full-time employees, but maybe not part-time employees? Is this something that's going to be available to people who have sterling disciplinary records? It's important to set those eligibility criteria and make it clear what they are. Regardless, any remote work policy should specify that it's a privilege that may be, revoked, and that the remote work policy can terminate at any time. That provides the employer with some flexibility should business or operational needs change. An effective remote work policy should also specify how often remote work is allowed, depending on operational needs, collaboration, workforce culture. Employers may choose to limit that. And with regard to the duration of the policy itself, employers may choose to set a time frame on that. For example, does it apply only in the context of a government declared emergency like the COVID pandemic? Expectations should be clear there. Employers should also reserve the right to call employees into the office on what would otherwise be remote days should the need call for it. That again provides for some flexibility. Remote work policy should describe the procedures with regard to remote work, how to request it, who must approve the request, how that request will be handled. Again, that helps to set expectations. And speaking of expectations, a really crucial component of a remote work policy is informing employees of what's expected of them while they're working remotely. They must be able to carry out the same duties, assignments, and work obligations that they would otherwise be performing in the office. They must be available to their supervisors, to their managers, to their colleagues, and the means by which they must be available should be specified too, whether it be telephone, email, video conferencing tools used by the company, or all of the above. And employees also need to be available to attend regularly scheduled meetings and participate in other required office activities, whether they're on-site or off-site. Policies should also spell out that employees need to devote their full working time and attention to work. Obviously, working from home can have its distractions, so employers should remind employees that remote work is not designed to be a replacement for dependent care, or unless otherwise agreed, to provide flexible working hours. Now, there may be reasons why an employer would want to do that, but if that's not the intention, it should be made clear in the policy. Application, let's go to the next slide and talk about the application of other policies. The remote work policy should specify that all other policies continue to be binding, and that violation of those policies of the remote work policy could lead to termination of a remote work scenario for that employee, or other disciplinary action up to and including termination. We talked about the recording of time earlier with regard to Charlie. Very important that time be kept, and overtime should be pre-approved by the manager. That should be spelled out in the policy too. Equipment costs and home office maintenance and supply subsidies. Expectations with regard to that should also be set in the policy. Notably, some jurisdictions require necessary expenses to be covered by an employer. In others, you've got more flexibility. So keeping on top of that law and deciding what's going to be covered and communicating those expectations to employees is helpful. Permissible locations, harking back to Jean and Anne, you probably want to specify where employees can be working remotely. If they're in possession of and using confidential information on a regular basis, you want to make sure that that's in a secure area and that we don't have the potential issues we had in that scenario. Also, the geographic locations. As we've talked about, there may be different laws that apply, so making sure that expectations are set with regard to where work is being performed would be helpful. Security and confidentiality, myriad protections you can include in your policy along these lines, using secure wireless networks, VPNs, regular password maintenance, up-to-date virus protection, up-to-date, software upgrades, you name it. Also important to include in your policy to the extent that that's a priority. And finally, safety. You want to make sure that, remote work stations are safe and that employees are reporting remote work injuries. There may be workers' compensation implications in your policy, though you want to specify that workers' compensation does not apply to third parties like family members who are injured at an employee's remote office space. And with that, we'll turn it back to our moderator, Dina.